Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It is November 6th. I am finally back from the East Coast. It has been a busy couple of weeks. It's time for some deep space updates. Starting with, of course, the 7 Starlink launches we've had in the last 2 weeks, 4 from Vandenberg, 3 from Florida. Then we get to the interesting launches. On the 24th of October, we had a Falcon 9 launching SpainSat NG2 to a geostationary transfer orbit from Slick 40 in Florida. Now, SpainSat NG2 is like an encrypted communications satellite for Spanish armed forces. It is replacing the existing SpainSat satellite. And this one was, well, interesting for a Falcon 9 because it was one where the booster was not recovered. Booster 1076 flew for the last time after 22 flights. It had previously launched things like CRS-26, SES-03B, Turksat, Eutelsat, MaxR2, all these things. It did a great job and then finally burned up over the Atlantic. On the 26th of October in Japan, we had an H324W launching of the HTV-X1. What does all that mean? Well, the HTV-X1 is the new version of the HTV cargo ferry that is used by Japan to send stuff to the International Space Station. The H3 is their new version of the rocket, and 24W means it has 2 engines, or 2 liquid-fueled engines, 4 solid rocket boosters, and it uses the wide fairing to accommodate that new version of the HTV spacecraft. This is a new configuration, both for the payload, the spacecraft, and the rocket. So yeah, this already flew to the International Space Station. It's docked. It's going to stay there for a few months, carrying a bunch of different cargo and a number of different satellites and payloads, which will be deployed after it leaves the International Space Station. So actually, because this was a test launch, apparently it was intentionally underloaded, mostly missing like stuff from the unpressurized cargo section. But apparently the thing that's limiting here is that they wanted to have the full autonomous flight termination system before they fully load this rocket. And by the way, it includes an experiment from a sake brewery called Dasai. And they're basically going to be attempting to run fermentation process and brew sake in space. 26th of October, China launched a Long March 3B/E from Xichang, Launch Complex 3. This was the Gaofen 14, basically sun synchronous orbit Earth observation satellite. It's like a high-resolution satellite that's part of their China high-resolution Earth observation system. So yeah, it's used for like land observation, urban planning, etc., etc. So this is they're basically their commercial, not their commercial, their civilian observation systems. Thursday, 1st of October, we had a Long March 2F/G launching from Jichuan, carrying Shenzhou 21, obviously going into low Earth orbit to the Chinese space station Tiangong. It's already docked. Now, the crew on this are Zhang Lu, who previously flew on Shenzhou 15, Wu Fei, and Zhang Hongzhong. Now, the biggest news is, I think, so far, the one that has certainly captured the interest of people around the world, is the special food that they brought with them. They brought chicken wings and steak, and they cooked them in orbit. So yes, barbecue in space. Well, okay, there'll be definitely people pointing out that technically it isn't barbecue, but you know what? It's meat that's being cooked on orbit, and I'm sure there's a bunch of astronauts out there who would really like to see what that's like. However, I'm going to point out there is now a bit of a problem because Shenzhou 20 appears to have some space debris damage, and so return of that has been delayed. But if they eventually, well, if they run out into trouble, I'm sure SpaceX could send something along. I believe the docking ports are compatible somewhat. 2nd of November, Falcon 9 bandwagon mission. That was a small-sat rideshare mission going to 45-degree inclination orbit. Now, I watched this from the roof of a hotel near the Space Center, and a bunch of us were up there. It was me, Tim Dodd, Katie Coleman, astronaut, Integza, Zyla Foxland. We watched this. It was amazing. We watched the booster come back down. It was kind of cool to watch this. So anyway, this was carrying like a CORSAT LEO imaging, ISA-3 SAR satellites, the StarCloud 1 demo mission. That's right, the first data center in orbit demo. And Haven also launched a piece of hardware to test various technologies for their space station, right? So Haven, Vast's Haven, right? So they tested like the solar panels and everything, unfolding and everything. So yeah, the reason I was in Florida was because we had the space gala for people to come and get together and do space stuff, and I was DJing there, yes, and then afterwards we had a rocket launch. It was like pretty perfect, I'm going to say. 2nd of November, India, using their LVM launch vehicle, put a GSAT-7R into geostationary transfer orbit. Now, this satellite had a mass of something like 4.4 tons, and while LVM is like the biggest rocket that India has, it isn't quite big enough to put this all the way to geostationary transfer orbit. It's like only going up to about 30,000 kilometers. So that's somewhat short, but the GSAT has the capability to push itself all the way up there. Also, part of this mission was that after they deployed the satellite, they waited a bit and then they demonstrated relighting the engine on their upper stage of their rocket. And that's kind of important for India because they want to be able to demonstrate that the rocket is capable of these relights, which is kind of required if you're going to be doing various multi-payload missions where you need to make maneuvers between each of these. 3rd of November, Long March 7A launched out of Wangchang with Yaogan 46. This is the second satellite that China has put into this medium Earth orbit. Very similar to Yaogan 45. It's got like a maybe 2,000 kilometer by 7,500 kilometer orbit. So it's very eccentric, 20-degree inclination. We're not sure quite what they're doing up there, but this is supposed to be basically military Earth observation reconnaissance. So that'll be interesting to figure out what's going on there. 4th of November, from Kourou, we had an Ariane 6 launch, 2 boosters, the 6.2 configuration. It was carrying Sentinel-1D. This is a sun-synchronous orbit Earth observation radar satellite. This is actually the 4th Sentinel-1 satellite that's been launched. These are built by Teleselenia. It was previously planned to be launched on Vega C, and this whole thing is, of course, part of Europe's Copernicus program, Earth observation component of like Europe's space program. Note, by the way, that this was originally supposed to be launched on the Vega 1C, or Vega C, but I'm not sure why they moved it to Ariane. But anyway, yeah, they moved it. And finally, 5th of November, we had Electron launching some satellites for IQPS, the synthetic aperture radar satellites. This was the 5th flight of 11 that they are contracted for. The flight was called The Nation God Navigates, and of course launched from New Zealand. And so now to the rest of the news. And I think the big piece of news that's been floating around the last few days is that Jared Isaacman is back, nominated to run NASA once again. So yeah, this has been a whole fascinating thing to watch. There's definitely been some like stuff going on behind the scenes for the last few weeks, even months. And I believe that I certainly met a number of people which were be hanging around and saying nice things about Jared. And I largely agree. Jared's a great person, very smart, and very passionate about spaceflight. So I see that his nomination, totally comfortable with that. I very much support it. But yeah, it's been interesting. I like to point out that he was the fastest person to be ever nominated to run NASA, and now because of the cancellation and then renomination, he's now the slowest. So yeah, Jared just getting those like records in there. Just add that to his like round the world flights and jet hours and various other things, and first private EVA. I'm sure he likes to hold that record. But yeah, it is. One of the stories that was interesting floating around about this was this word about Project Athena, and that was basically a set of plans that he drew up during his first nomination process, and it talked about how he would try to address things that he felt that NASA needed to address, so to move forwards, things like trying to move more of NASA's science into science as a service, kind of like, hey, have a CLIPS mission. Now, could we ask commercial providers just to build an instrument to do this kind of science? That's one thing. Talking about moving the work by various centers, for example, taking some of the aerospace work at Langley and moving it to Armstrong, where it's kind of actually where they do a lot of flight testing. But anyway, this document that got written and it mysteriously leaked. And there was a lot of discussion about why did this leak? Well, apparently the version that was leaked was only given to 2 people, one of whom was like Sean Duffy and his assistant. So the theory is that this was intentionally leaked to people like legacy contractors who may have different opinion about how NASA spends its money. And the message we're getting from this, of course, is that Jared's all in on big commercial, fast, private development of space, and Sean Duffy wants the support of all the legacy contractors. Regardless, at this point, Jared has been re-nominated, but he is going to have to go through a bunch of hearings again. And because he's going through a bunch of hearings with people that have support from legacy contractors, he might have to disavow some of the statements in that. I don't know. I think that NASA needs somebody that runs it. One other thing that comes up in Project Athena is a section which was developed with someone from SpaceX, like SpaceX's propulsion engineer, Lewis Gillis, where they talk about a nuclear electric propulsion strategy, which I think is a kind of an important thing for operating in space. Now, it doesn't solve all the problems, but it has its specific niches where it could work very, very well. Of course, nuclear electric propulsion is how the mothership moves around in The Martian, and we all know we'd like to see parts of that story happen for real. Anyway, before Jared was re-nominated, there was a lot of discussion of the human landing system, with various committees and political statements, interviews, and there was 2 previous NASA administrators, Charles Bolden and Jim Bridenstine, that both got involved in this debate. Obviously, Sean Duffy had been making some noise at SpaceX, implying that they're not moving fast enough with Starship. Well, Charles Bolden, he's like, well, being fast isn't as important as actually doing something useful when you get there. So, like, his whole argument is the US, sure, getting there quickly is useful, but the US is really falling down on planning for what to do to stay there long term. Now, Jim Bridenstine, he came in another angle. He said, SpaceX is taking too long. We should find someone else that can build this really fast. I know exactly the person, and it's implied that it would be someone like Lockheed, which, I'm sure Lockheed can build a spacecraft very quickly. They've only been working on Orion for the last 25 years or so, thereabouts. Now, SpaceX had a very specific response to Jim Bridenstine. They said, like many Americans, we are thankful to Mr. Bridenstine's service. Leading NASA at one point, he deserves credit for spearheading the creation of the Artemis program. But they go on to say that after departing NASA, he created a lobbying firm called the Artemis Group, representing a host of aerospace companies vying for NASA business, basically pointing out that, yeah, Bridenstine is a lobbyist and, he's saying what gets him the money. Anyway, after, Sean Duffy made all that noise about SpaceX not being quickly enough, they actually published a number of updates on Starship a couple of weeks ago, just before Halloween. And they apparently have delivered their updates to NASA for how they will modify their approach to make things faster. NASA has acknowledged that it's received these from plans from SpaceX, Blue Origin, and other potential applicants who are interested in building HLS. But at this point, they're going to have to wait for NASA to come back, and it'll be a question of whether a decision is made before potential Jared comes on and actually gets to make that decision. So anyway, yeah, moving on. Let's talk about other stuff. So, Iridium. Yes, Iridium, you can imagine that they might be having some trouble right now. I mean, they are a satellite phone company, and SpaceX is basically saying, you know what? You don't need a satellite phone. We have Starlink that can talk to regular phones. So, Iridium are definitely looking at a future where their product is increasingly limited in its utility over regular phones. And they have, one of their solutions is that they are starting to offer a new service, a new bit of hardware called a PNT chip, basically position, navigation, and timing. They are pitching it to device makers who want to avoid GPS spoofing, right? So this will be a technology that uses Iridium's network, it'll use the GPS network, and it will be much harder to spoof if you are needing that kind of technology. Australia's HEO has been doing a lot of work the last few months. They've been taking photographs of satellites in low Earth orbit, things like the International Space Station. But recently, they published images of a Chinese test satellite called Zinshu Jiangjiang 7. And this is like a fairly large object. It's like 3 tons. It's something like 3 meters by 9 meters in size. It was launched in a deployed form, in a compactor form, and then it deployed an antenna. It's basically a synthetic aperture radar satellite with fixed solar arrays. The whole thing has to perform its own attitude control. Anyway, it's interesting because, of course, all these things that China launches, if they don't show us it, we don't actually know what it looks like. So HEO has taken an image of this and they sort of tried to guess what it was all about. But it's very cool to see this thing, even though it was just about to, deorbit. Incidentally, Maxar, they also published images of Chinese satellites earlier in the year. And interestingly, China's response was to take a photo of a Maxar satellite and say, well, this is what your Legion 2 satellite looks like. And I'm going to say, if you want to know what a Legion 2 satellite looks like, I have a Lego model of one sitting there. So, yeah, good on you, China, getting the super secrets out there. A Washington, D.C. startup called Beskar, that's spelled with an X, and it's obviously making reference to Star Wars. They are basically wanting to fly some test hardware on a Falcon 9 booster, right? The section of the interstage, it goes up and it comes back down. So it spends some amount of time launching and landing. And apparently they want to launch some of their hardware on there to verify that it can survive the liftoff and landing forces. Now, Beskar is really interested in doing semiconductor wafer manufacturing and development in space. They want to use, again, ultra clean, ultra vacuum environments, very similar to the Wake Shield story that I told a few weeks ago. They want to be doing this in space. It'll be like a payload the size of the microwave oven, and it's just going to test their hardware. I just find it fascinating that SpaceX are agreeing to attach this to the top of one of their Falcon 9 boosters rather than inside the payload fairing. It doesn't need to go orbit, it just needs to experience the forces of going up and the forces of going down. Over in China, the group of their engineers, they've successfully completed ground tests of an inflatable, reconfigurable space station module, which could enable much larger space stations in the future. Obviously, space stations are limited by the diameter of the rocket. Well, there's a couple of companies in the US, Sierra Space is one. They have the Life inflatable habitat. I believe Lockheed has an inflatable habitat as well. And obviously, we have the old Bigelow Station module on the International Space Station. But China showed pictures that they are very much working on this same technology to expand their space living area capabilities. In commercial space, Intuitive Machines, you might remember the company that has tried to land on the moon twice and fallen over on both of those. They announced on November 4th that it's buying a company called Lanteris, which you probably don't remember. But if you were paying attention a couple of months ago, I mentioned that they were changing their name from Maxar to Lanteris. So yes, Maxar, satellite builder, the people that built the Legion, they're being bought by a much newer, almost much smaller company, Intuitive Machines. This deal is supposedly worth $800 million, and it does give Intuitive Machines handholds in a market which they currently have no position in, since they're all about building landers. Over in Boca Chica, not much has been going on, not much in the way of testing, but we have been watching as ever so slowly a group of engineers, mechanics, technicians, whatever, they start tearing out the old launch site. Yes, that orbital launch mount that didn't actually launch anything to orbit is being taken down ever so slowly. It's not been destroyed by Starship rocket engines. No, it survived all that. It is instead being cut up slowly using cutting torches. It will be replaced by the new version of the orbital launch mount, which is higher and has room for a proper flame diverter. Yes, the shower head is going to be going away, replaced by a far more, conventional technology. But yeah, it would be really nice to get some pieces of that as souvenirs, but I'm sure I'm sure some pieces will find their way into private hands. It would be nice to get one, right? In SoCal, we had the X-59. It made its first flight, and I know technically not space flight, but it is part of NASA. This is the X-plane, the quiet supersonic test vehicle, and it is, well, it's a super long-nosed thing that's designed to make very little sonic boom noise. It took its first flight out of like Palmdale and basically flew over to Edwards. Now, it didn't land straight away. It actually flew at 250 knots, 12,000 feet, in circles, like verifying that it would fly. That's a very ambitious first test flight. It got up and it did a lot of flying, and then it's now landed at Edwards. So presumably, they're going to review the data from this test flight and verify that they're ready to start pushing the envelope and maybe going a little bit faster. Another piece of NASA news that came out, which, there's not been a lot of NASA news, by the way, because a lot, like the PR side of NASA is shut down because of the government shutdown. So a lot of stories that they would normally be telling are simply not being told, but things are still happening there. And one thing that happened is that Joe Acaba, who was the chief of the astronaut office, is no longer chief of the astronaut office. He's been replaced by Scott Tingle, but we don't know what happened here. Now, his predecessor, Reed Wiseman, he did the classic NASA office of astronaut office thing of assigning himself to the mission he wanted and then stepping down. So he's on Artemis 2. Joe Acaba, he may have done the same thing. He may have assigned himself to Artemis 3, which would be interesting, or something else may have happened. I don't know. We're not getting the information, but I'd really like to see if if he ends up getting assigned. Like the window between Reed stepping down and getting assigned was actually quite long, and so we're looking at the Artemis 2 flight, next year, early next year, and presumably soon after that we'll be finding out who's supposed to be going on Artemis 3. Another consequence of the government shutdown has been that the FAA has been having to start scaling back flights. Air traffic controllers working without pay. They are, some of them are calling in sick, and we've had a few cases of airports running without any ground controllers, without any tower controllers. Happened at Burbank. It happened at Orlando the night before I was supposed to fly in, but thankfully it didn't affect me. But FAA has asked for like a 10% reduction at the major airports. Those are all the big hubs, Class B airspace, all next to big cities, like San Francisco, obviously. But they also announced just like a couple of hours ago that all commercial space flights are banned from flying during daylight hours. Basically, between before 6 a.m., after 10 p.m., that's when they're supposed to fly. So like 10 p.m. through to 6 a.m., they get an 8-hour window when you can do commercial rocket launches. So that will cover a bunch of things, mostly from SpaceX, I would imagine. Now, Starlink, I think you can probably reschedule Starlinks to only use things where in the middle of the night makes sense. Some of the stuff that may not work. So for example, the Escapade mission, it's going to work with a very specific launch window. They don't have control over it, but it is a government mission. So presumably it gets to choose like when it goes. On the other hand, transporter missions, those are going to sun-synchronous orbit. They have to launch at a certain time because that's the plane that they've promised their customers, and the missions may be chosen based on that. So they might have to wait, or they might have to ask for an exception or something. I do find it rather interesting that, by the way, this comes a couple of weeks after Sean Duffy was getting in a fight with Elon online, and the FAA suddenly passes a rule which definitely affects SpaceX more than almost anyone else, because they're doing the most purely commercial launches. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on there. I'm not sure when this will get fixed. Finally, Blue Origin. They've been test firing the new Glenn, ready for its second flight. It's going to be carrying Escapade A and B, of course, to Mars, and ideally landing on Jacqueline. What are the odds? Well, never tell me the odds. That's what it's called. So yeah, this mission will be flying possibly as early as this weekend. It's currently slated for Sunday.
might end up going next week. You know, these things are frequently delayed, but I'll be excited to see this, because this is second flight of New Glenn. They're going to take another go at the landing attempt. Odds are they don't make it, but they're more likely to make it on their second flight than almost anyone else at this point, since Blue Origin have actually got a decent amount of heritage with landing boosters, albeit boosters that have gone straight up and straight down. Now, Escapade is going to Mars, and because of the whole Mars window situation, it's actually not quite going to Mars. It's barely getting kicked out of Earth's, out of Earth's influence into a heliocentric orbit, where it will come back next year and then get a kick and maybe some propulsion and stuff, which will send it off into deep space and finally onwards to Mars. These two small satellites were built at Berkeley, which is near me. The instruments were designed there. They're built with Rocket Lab as well, building the satellite buses. I'm very excited to see this mission go. Again, it is a very, very small payload on a very, very big rocket, and I'm excited to see what happens this Sunday. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.